Well, hello there. Thank you for joining me today. You might want to pull up a chair, grab a snack. I have several things to chat about today. Let me just go through the list real quick. I am going to be talking about several things, but primarily focusing on the Pentagon. Pentagon, pentagram, the Pentagon's bottomless money pit. The Pentagon fails the sixth audit in a row. So for the last 6 years, the Pentagon has not been able to pull together a budget. And some marvelous person also did a complete review of the Pentagon missile attacks from 9/11 to show that they were all fake. And the Defense Department, DOD, top sharers of child pornography, lots of pornography on those Department of Defense budgets. They're paying their people to sit there and watch and share child pornography. Is that the reason why they can't get their budget straight? Biden's demand for $105 billion in military spending, a declaration of war against the middle class. Exploring the impact and history of U.S. foreign aid. And as an interesting side note, I'll put a clip down below how the richest Hamas, Hamas, the so-called people that are hanging out in Palestine, well, they're very rich. So I put together, somebody did a show about them and the Hamas wealthy people and something else. And I would also like to talk to you about lemon water and detoxing from radiation. And also, did you know there is a new way to decarbonize marijuana on the stove? I have a clip down below, and I'll tell you where it starts. The clip is from a group called Ganja Grandma. And you just have to seal it up and you can boil it on your stove and it won't get any odor in your house and save you the expense of a machine. So let me get over here. Okay. I guess the plan now is immigrants are getting free plane tickets to get out of here. And I believe that it's the exact same thing that's happened since the very beginning. They were lied to. They were told that America is a place of dreams and hopes. And then they come here and they find out that, well, here's your tent. It's cold here and you're going to be sleeping on the streets. The smart ones will get out of here quick because the early packages are always the best. So get out of here while you can. Okay. I don't know what your plan is for down the road without medical care, or if your intention is to continue to see medical doctors, but I would advise you to be very careful of what you say to your doctor. For example, if you were to tell your doctor that you had a history with alcohol, even though you may not have had a drink in years, your friendly doctor can write on your chart that you are, in fact, an alcoholic. And how will that affect you? Well, in a million ways. It'll affect future employment. It'll affect your insurance policies because they will now view you as a high risk. So just be careful what you're talking about, okay? And I don't know if your plan is to set up some sort of medical marijuana system within your own house. You may have people now that'll say, oh, I'd never take marijuana. You would be surprised what people will do when that is their only option, because it is critical to be able to sleep to restore the body. I would not have made it this long if I had not been able to sleep at nighttime. And it's always a challenge. So I did a quick look around and Fern Valley Farms, that's farms, Farms. Remember that? Their weed, if you buy 4 ounces, is only $32 per ounce of marijuana. $32, okay? So that for $130, you get 4 ounces of marijuana. Also, because nausea is going to be a thing, so I'm not sure what your plan is for dealing with the nausea, but I'm also using lemon water to deal with the nausea and kind of tamper back a little bit of this stuff. But when that nausea hits, I'm telling you, if you don't have any way to stop it, there was a point here in the beginning that everybody was throwing up, okay? And now I pretty much have the as well underhand as I am able to, okay? So it is the only thing that will tamper down that nausea, because for a long time, all you're going to feel is this low grade kind of nausea that you're not going to really identify as anything. And the only thing to knock it out is with weed. And I don't know what the plan is when they cut off deliveries and stop trucks and all that kind of stuff, but I would suggest that you put some of your funding toward some things you're going to need to access. One last thing, this other company, Pharma, CBD, Pharma, CBD, they have a deal, a Black Friday deal starting today for gummy bears. Now, these gummy bears are extraordinarily strong. They're 100 micrograms per gummy bear. But here's the deal. They're like 45% off today, okay? And 45% off. And then you also put in coupon code HOLLY, HOLLY. And you will then get that pack of 20 gummies of 100 micrograms each for about less than $20 for 20 of them. Extraordinarily good price. So that's all I have for that. So I would suggest you move into some sort of defensive action, because it may be too late once you figure out what's going on. And if you don't have anything in your arsenal, I can tell you, you'll be pretty miserable. Okay, let's get going on here. Because I was looking at money, it's really weird. Remember, Stanford University was started by eugenics, right? Well, they all were, but specifically, I have talked about Stanford in the past. And I'm always talking about those subsidies and federal funds. Do you realize that? And now, because of all these things on campuses now, students protesting against the wars and stuff, now people are taking a closer look at who's funding these universities. So, kind of interesting. The group found that Stanford University acquired federal funds at a higher clip than any other elite universities over a 5-year span. According to their analysis, the school, Stanford University, received roughly $7 billion with a B in taxpayer-backed cash between 2018 and 2022, including federal grants and contracts. So if you're wondering why people in this country don't have money for food, it's because the elites are gobbling it all up. I just love the way they talk about us, like, well, the working class. And then they all try to act like they're part of the working class. Stop lying to us. Stop lying to yourself. We see you. Okay, now here's another thing that you want to pay attention to. These crooks. Ohio Republican leadership is stepping up its efforts to alter the successful cannabis legislation initiative that passed on November the 7th by a comfortable margin. It was on the ballot in Ohio to pass for weed to be available. I think it was like 55% of people voted for it, okay? But they don't like that. They don't want us to have access to something that isn't laden with chemicals. President of the Senate, Ohio Senate, said he is in agreement with Governor DeWine that lawmakers should quickly revise the approved initiative before cannabis possession and cultivation become legal on December the 7th. DeWine is urging lawmakers to make changes before it's too late. Somehow I'm tempted to break into song. What's that old song about? It's too late, it's too late. Okay. And this is something that's kind of funny. My grandmother did not say this, okay? But I heard this guy saying, and I thought it was pretty funny, because they were talking about liars, people who lie to us, right? Which is all the people on the screen, right? I've been saying this for years. If they are on the screen, they are highly likely on the team, right? So what did this person said when he was talking about liars? He said, well, my grandmother used to say, tell that one to a jackass and you'll get your brains kicked in. And let me see here. how the richest Hamas secretly travel. I want you to watch that clip. It's something else. The Hamas people, the leader of Hamas, look suspiciously like the Soleimani, the supposedly Iranian general that got taken out by a drone. Soleimani. And the new guy, the Hamas guy, looks exactly like him. And yeah, so how are they flashing around all this cash and nobody's paying attention, right? They're supposed to be for the people, right? Okay, so, and I will have some files over there that I'm not going to be discussing, things like the U.S. military spending every year since 1970. Okay. And I was looking at more of this spending. The U.S. sent billions to Saudi Arabia, and that money directly contributed to their ongoing conflict in Yemen. The United States provides foreign aid, and the United States is bankrupt, right? Let's not forget that fact. The United States declared itself bankrupt years ago. It is a bankrupt corporation. It's all been about the lies. So they go around playing the big bucks, handing out money to everybody, right? Money that the people in the United States work for. There are very few exceptions. Iran and North Korea, for example. The United States also provides aid to countries such as Pakistan that actually vote against the U.S. position in the United Nations over and over again. We're not just buying support for the U.S. with our foreign assistance programs, we're trying to achieve some deeper long-term objectives in terms of both political and economic development. No, they're there to crush people, okay? Whether sending aid to governments directly or to non-government organizations trying to help countries in crisis is not as simple as it seems. For example, the millions of dollars of foreign aid intended for civilians affected by the Syrian civil war were siphoned off by the Syrian government. The regime in Syria is still facing restrictions from the US and EU. Research has shown that if you provide money to governments, they can redirect their existing spending to other ends. A study out of the University of Washington demonstrated that for each US dollar that was provided to a set of African countries for healthcare spending, they reduced their own internal budgeting for healthcare by $1.10. At the same time, providing directly to NGOs or charitable agencies can prevent a state from ever developing its own capacity to provide these services. Yeah, isn't that the kind of the effect of these NGOs to cripple these people, right? Get them totally reliant on these NGOs. I'll go on to say, and as I see this in places like Haiti, where NGOs have essentially taken over all of the services functions of the state, like providing health care and in many instances, education and other basic services. But there is also substantial evidence that foreign aid can and has been impactful, especially for disease eradication, humanitarian aid, and more. In recent years, other countries have increased foreign aid, which some argue is a new frontier in the battle for soft power. China, for example, has quickly increased spending across the Africa continent. China tends to use a different model of aid than the U.S., relying more on loans with interest. Other rivals like Russia have increased sending aid as well. While the conflict in Ukraine and Gaza pressing on, the debate over how the U.S. sends its aid overseas will likely heat up in Congress. No, it's not going to likely heat up in Congress because they're too busy stuffing their psychopathic pockets. So, Biden demanded $105 billion for military spending. I'm getting to the military spending in a part here. You know, they get more money than any other group. In his national address, this last Thursday, U.S. President Josephine Biden demanded Congress allocate an additional $105 billion to fund the U.S. military, escalate the U.S. NATO war against Russia and Ukraine, and arm the Israeli military with bullets, bombs, and shells for its genocidal campaign against the people of occupied Palestine. And it's always so interesting because the U.S. always positions itself as a good guy. How do you stand there with a bullet to somebody's head and still claim you are the good guy? This massive trunk of money is greater than the GDP of 2/3 of the countries on Earth, which would cause unimaginable levels of death and destruction in the months ahead. The latest demand includes $14 billion for Israel on top of the $260 billion the U.S. has provided in military aid since 1948. So since 1948, the U.S. has given $260 billion, and now they want another $14 billion. And $61 billion for Ukraine, nearly doubling the $75 billion spent on the war against nuclear-armed Russia so far. Biden is also demanding $3 billion for military submarines, $2 billion for the military encirclement of China, and $14 billion to further militarize the U.S.-Mexico border and criminalize immigration as a sop to Trump and the far right wing of the political establishment. Biden said that the $105 billion is necessary to make sure those who cause chaos and death and destruction are made to pay a price for their aggression. Now, was Biden looking in a mirror when he said that? Because I'll repeat it. Biden said that the $105 billion is necessary to make sure those who cause chaos and death and destruction are made to pay a price for their aggression, says the most aggressive country known in the history of man. Over 20 years ago, then President George W. Bush used the same language to justify launching imperialist wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, which were to last 20 years, kill more than 1 million people, and cost more than $8 trillion, according to Brown University's Cost of War Project. A 2022 report published by the Pentagon admitted that each taxpayer paid $8,278 for the wars in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan from 2001 to 2021, though the true figure is likely an order of magnitude higher because, yes, they're claiming that this cost $8 trillion with a T, right? Putting each taxpayer on the hook for $8,278. But I'll be getting to the good part in a minute here because the Department of Defense does not have a budget that they can balance. In concluding his speech, Biden called for shared sacrifice to fund the escalation of war on a global scale. In moments like these, we have to remember who we are. We are the United States of America. The United States of America. Isn't that creepy when he does that? And there's nothing beyond our capacity if we do it together. Make no mistake, the U.S. population will not pay for these wars together. The cost will be borne entirely by the working class, while the spoils will go to the rich. Biden's demand is a declaration of war against the working class, and all talk about shared sacrifice to defend democracy is nothing but lies. In reality, the U.S.-led wars for which this money has been earmarked are wars of imperialist conquest, fought to enrich the ruling elite and secure the world's resources and markets for Wall Street and corporate America, no matter the cost in lives or dollars. The allocation of $105 billion for war comes at the direct expense of the working class, the vast majority of whom live paycheck to paycheck, and nearly half of whom are not able to cover a $400 expense with cash on hand. Every dollar spent on the wars will come at the expense of social programs and entitlements like Medicare and Social Security. Now, just to point one thing out, they always refer to these things as entitlements. They are not entitlements. Entitlements mean they're like giving it to us. People paid into these systems. They're not getting something for free. And they've also have robbed all of these things like Medicare. So that's why there's no money there, because they pulled all the money out. According to a 2023 study from the National Priorities Project, $100 billion is more than the federal government will spend all year on education. They spend $84 billion. Transportation, $67 billion. Or energy or the environment, $94 billion. It equals the total budget for healthcare, $100 billion. Total military-related spending this year alone will exceed $1.1 trillion. The Biden administration's demand comes as workers have been told there is no money to address the world population's most urgent needs. For $100 billion, Biden could house every homeless person in America, feed every person facing starvation or acute malnutrition across the world, forgive $30,000 in student loans for 2 million people, and still have over $10 billion left over. The same corporations brained for war and profiting from it will not be asked to share in the sacrifice. Earlier this year, a report from the Congressional Budget Office explained that tax revenue fell 9% in 2022 alone as a result of decades of tax cuts for the wealthy. According to the CBO, that's the Congressional Budget Office, revenue on corporate taxes fell $5 billion from 2022 to 2023. A 2023 study from the GAO reported that 34% of large corporations now pay zero in federal taxes. As a result of the systemic slashing of corporate taxes, endless Wall Street bailouts, and record military spending, the U.S. budget deficit doubled in 2023, jumping from $1 trillion to $2 trillion. Biden's demand exposes the totally anti-democratic character of the political system, where popular pro-Palestinian and anti-war sentiment finds no reflection whatsoever. On Friday, CBS released a poll showing that 57% of Americans support sending humanitarian aid to Palestine versus only 48% who support sending weapons to Israel. Regardless, the Senate passed a resolution supporting Israel by a 97-0 margin. Pseudo-left figures like Democratic Socialist of America member AOC are enthusiastic supporters of the Biden administration and have openly endorsed arming Israel even as it engages in horrific war crimes. Biden's demand for $105 billion will be deeply unpopular, and his incoherent speech will convince no one. Substantial demonstrations have taken place in almost every American city denouncing Israeli war crimes, and protests have only grown in the aftermath of the horrific bombings of the Al-Halali hospital in Gaza City by Israeli forces, which killed nearly 500 people. Given the barrage of pro-war propaganda in the corporate media, such opposition marks a significant breakdown of the media military industrial complex. And it's the biggest breakdown that I have seen in my 72 years, really. This is a big breakdown. I just hope it keeps going. In face of the growing opposition from below, Biden is demanding the total subordination of the economy to the needs of U.S. imperialism. In his speech, he called for a transition to war production, saying that just as in World War II, today, patriotic American workers are building the arsenal of democracy and serving the cause of freedom. Kind of funny how patriotic American workers are building the arsenal of democracy. Yeah, get a lot of democracy when you got a gun standing over somebody's head now, don't you? His demand for replenishing our stockpiles with an endless flow of weapons will require the suppression of the class struggle, dangerous speed ups, and the illegalization of strikes. In this effort, Biden has a willing partner in the trade union bureaucracies, which have become inseparable from the Democratic Party and the imperialist state and have worked for decades to prevent strikes, maintain production, and enable record corporate profits. Earlier this month, UAW President Shawn Fain appeared with Biden at the Willow Run plant in Michigan, noted that the plant formerly produced bombers and referred to the union's membership as part of the arsenal of democracy. This is a direct signal that the bureaucracy is collaborating with the Biden administration to keep the flow of deadly weapons moving to all of U.S. imperialist expanding theaters of war. War against American imperialist rivals and targets abroad means war against the working class at home. Although the bureaucracies are struggling to contain the growing strike movement in the U.S., which has spread in recent days, we're already past that. So in reality, it would cost only $15 billion to pay all 150,000 Big Three workers $100,000 per year, and this represents just 15% of what Biden claims is urgently needed for war. The stage is set for the next phase of the development of the global class struggle, in which strikes and protests are increasingly coinciding with a growing political awakening of workers and young people across the world. This raises the decisive need for political leadership to prevent the imperialist governments and their pseudo-left cheerleaders from diverting and suppressing opposition as they have done in the past, and to fight for the development of an independent revolutionary movement against imperial war and the capitalist system. That is the perspective of the Socialist Equality Party. It's all a trap. Their people have infiltrated it all. Okay, the U.S. has sent more than $74 billion in aid to Ukraine. To put that in historical context, that dwarfs many other major aid packages in times of crisis. Over the last 2 years, the annual average of aid to Ukraine exceeded the annual average of military spending during the war in Afghanistan. So in the last 2 years, they've spent more on Ukraine than the average spending during Afghanistan. Pretty alarming, huh? According to one analysis, according to one analysis by the Council of Foreign Relations, aid for Ukraine last year was comparable to the entire budget for the state of Virginia. And yet the aid was still just a fraction of the defense budget, which was set at $703 billion last year. I'm not going to go through the whole budget thing because I have been harping on this for years now, but the budget for the military far exceeds any poverty programs for kids or food, or they take money off of kids' plates, serve them garbage in schools so they can protect the money to murder. When you look at Ukraine's aid as a percentage of the country's GDP, the U.S. isn't at the top of the list. Countries in Scandinavia and Eastern Europe are spending much more. And the amount of aid will only continue to grow both during and after the conflict. Americans need to get off of social media. No, I'm just kidding. It is true, though. Focus, okay? Do you really need to listen to those people one more time calling you the working class? Focus, people, focus, okay? They're not here to help any of us with their illustrious college degrees. Well, we need our academics to talk to the working class because we're so much more educated than those people, the working class. Americans need to better understand why we're providing aid to these countries, but also the relative balance of military and economic assistance and why these battles are being played out in Congress. Since the Cold War, the U.S. has been the biggest distributor of foreign aid in the world, both to international organizations like the United Nations and directly to state governments. The fiscal year starts October the 1st. That's their fiscal year runs from October to October. And in the first month, okay, now I'm going to be getting into why the U.S. was spending all that money bankrupting itself, right? Well, the U.S. was already bankrupt, okay? Let's keep that straight. They went bankrupt as a corporation, never been fixed, okay? So now the U.S. has close to $33 trillion in debt, okay? The fiscal year starts October the 1st. And in the first month, the Treasury shelled out $88.9 billion in interest on its debt securities, while the Department of Defense spent $83.4 billion on military programs. So they're now spending $88.9 billion. I think that's per month, just on the interest for this $33 trillion. They have signed all of us up. Go look at my timeline. Do a control F, control find. Look for birth certificate. You and me, we were all sold out. Our birth certificates are what they use to collateralize the U.S. debt. All the information is there. Stop ignoring the facts, okay? Okay, so, and every year it escalates. I just pulled some base numbers. Okay, starting in this whole budget thing, they haven't been able to reconcile the budget from, I think, around 2016 or so, okay? What that means is since 2016 or 2017, the Department of Defense, with its $83 billion in military programs, has not had a balanced budget. They do not know where the money went. So let's start off in 2017. The defense budget for 2018 was $682. A 5.3 increase from 2017. They went up another 7.6 increase in 2018. They went up another 6% in 2019. And they went up another 2.86% from 2020. And I would encourage you to take a look, the U.S. military spending every year since 1970. So, America's gross national debt hit an eye-watering $33 trillion for the first time in September. And in fact, is currently closer to the $34 trillion mark. In response, the U.S. is now spending more in gross interest on Treasury debt securities than it does on national defense, according to the Treasury's latest monthly statement. And the lies are so big, don't forget, the Federal Reserve is not federal. It has nothing to do with anything. The Federal Reserve is a privately owned corporation. And good luck figuring out who actually owns it. I imagine it's the 1% that own the Federal Reserve. So they do all these money tricks with the Federal Reserve, and who pays the balance when they come up short? Well, that's where Congress and the tax money comes in. The Federal Reserve, which is not federal. Oh, the lies are so deep. Okay. Okay. This is particularly alarming when you consider how much of the federal budget goes into defense, with the U.S. outspending every other country. The last few years have been expensive. A deficit is what happens when the government spends more money in a fiscal year than it brings in through taxes. And the last few years have been expensive for the United States. Several large bills with hefty price tags have been approved since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, including the American Rescue Plan Act, which cost $1.9 trillion. The Pentagon, and let's talk a little bit about the Pentagon, okay? And I have more information. The Pentagon, also the same as the pentagram, Satan thing, right? The Pentagon serves as the headquarters of the U.S. Department of Defense, DOD. Hi, Virginia. As a symbol of the United States military, the Pentagon is frequently used to refer to the Department of Defense rather than the building itself. So when you hear the word the Pentagon, it means the Department of Defense. It has the most floor space of any office building. In addition, it is the only standing peacetime military installation. And remember the five pointed stars, that has to do with their worshiping of Saturn. So everything is about fives. The Pentagon is located on 5 acres of land in Washington, D.C., near the Capitol Belt and Rock Creek Park. Construction on what is now known as the Pentagon began in 1772 when George Washington was president of the United States. The original structure was a simple 2-story brick house with a wooden roof. It was 40 feet by 50 feet, had 9 rooms, and was surrounded by a 6-foot-high stone wall. The first Pentagon served as the home of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson after they were elected president and vice president, respectively. It also housed Congress during its early years before it established offices of its own. The second Pentagon was built in 1855, getting to a more realistic time frame here, in the Italian Renaissance style. Now, isn't that interesting? The second Pentagon was built in 1855 in the Italian Renaissance style. Just like they named it the Roman Catholic Church, right? This version has 3 stories high with 131 rooms for federal employees. The third Pentagon was completed in 1973 at a cost of $750 million. It is an extension of the Capitol building across the mall from the White House. I guess it's not in Virginia. The Pentagon has been the site of many major events in American history. It has been captured by enemy forces twice during the War of 1812 and the Civil War. What does the Pentagon do for the United States? The Pentagon serves as the headquarters for the United States Department of Defense. So, is the Pentagon an actual Pentagon? The Pentagon serves as Department of Defense. The word, the Pentagon, so they just refer to it as the Pentagon, right? Okay. No, wait a minute. I'm back in Virginia. Is the Pentagon a real place? The Pentagon serves as a headquarters for the U.S. Department of Defense. The structure was planned by American architect George Bergstrom in Arlington County, Virginia, across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. Okay, it was completed in 1936. Okay, so that's enough about that. Let's see here. There's a lot to this whole thing. Is the Pentagon able to house the entire Defense Department? Despite the initial design for the facility, the Pentagon has never been able to hold the full United States Defense Department, despite the military's repeated contradictions through the years. The Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia, serves as the Department of Defense's headquarters. What is the origin of the Pentagon's name? That's a no-brainer. But how did the Pentagon, DOD, massive headquarters take shape? That's a different story. The structure was initially intended to fit on a plot of land with 5 corners. The DOD, which we'll be talking about today, the people doing all the porn and the ones that spending all the money, the DOD has 2 main components: the Unified Combatant Commanders and the military departments. The presidentially appointed Unified Combatant Commanders direct the activities of the armed forces at war with Germany and Japan during World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. So that would be the Unified Combatant Commanders. They're also responsible for planning major military operations. The Secretaries of Defense serve under the Unified Commander who leads the department when the commander is absent. Okay. And like everything else, information is kind of screwy, right? Because other places say the Pentagon was built between 1941 and 1945. Okay. So the Pentagon was originally built as a military academy for the U.S. Army. President Abraham Lincoln signed a bill on July the 1st, 1864, authorizing the building of a military college. Okay. Upon completion, the newly formed U.S. Military Academy took upon residents in the building. Well, I'm not that interested in that anymore. Okay. Let's get into the pentagram and the Pentagon. Okay. Pentagram, you will usually hear pentagrams being used with black magic and stuff like that. Despite their differences, pentagram and pentagon share several similarities. One of the most striking similarities is that both shapes have 5 exterior points and the same number of sides. The pentagram has 5 points that form the shape of the star, while the pentagon has 5 points connecting its 5 equal sides to form the polygon. Both shapes are geometrically symmetrical and have a pleasing and balanced appearance. Another similarity between pentagram and pentagon is their association with the number 5, which holds significant meaning in various cultures and religions. The number 5 is often seen as a symbol of balance and harmony, as well as being associated with the 5 elements in many belief systems. In the case of the pentagram, the 5 points of the star are often associated with the 5 elements of earth, air, fire, water, and spirit. In the case of the pentagon, the 5 equal-sided represent balance and symmetry and are often associated with the concept of wholeness and completeness. Additionally, both shapes have significant cultural significance. The pentagram has been used in different cultures and religions worldwide as a symbol of protection and spirituality. It has been used in various forms and contexts, such as in ancient Greece, Egypt, and Christianity. The Pentagon, on the other hand, is a symbol of the U.S. military and government. It represents the country's power and strength and has played an important role in many historical events. While pentagram and pentagon have several differences, they also share similarities. I think I already said that. Okay. Now we talk about common misconceptions of the pentagram and pentagon shapes. There are several misconceptions. There are several misconceptions associated with the pentagram and the pentagon, which have led to misunderstandings and controversies. Pentagram misconceptions. One of the most common, I don't know, I always have this idea that I should check to make sure I'm still logged in. One of the most common misconceptions about the pentagram is that it is associated with Satanism or witchcraft. However, this is a modern interpretation that deviates from the pentagram's original meaning. The pentagram has been used as a symbol of protection, magic, and spirituality in different cultures. The upside-down pentagram or inverted pentagram has been associated with Satanism. But this is a modern interpretation that does not align with the pentagram's original meaning. Well, I got an idea here. If you find out that your name means something kind of evil, well, why don't you just change your name, right? It was kind of like the United Nations has a publisher. The publisher who publishes all of the United Nations works, their books and all the printed materials for the entire United Nations, is a corporation called Lucis Trust, Lucis Trust. Well, early on, Lucis Trust was called Lucifer Trust, okay? And I guess, according to these freaks, Lucifer Trust was just a bridge too far. So, so they came up with his name. I was not involved in coming up with this name, were you? However, some people have associated the pentagon shape with negative connotations, such as war, imperialism, or government conspiracy theories. Another misconception associated with both shapes is that they are exclusively associated with a particular culture, religion, or belief system. While the pentagram has been used in different cultures and religions worldwide, it does not belong exclusively to any of them. Similarly, while the Pentagon is a symbol of the U.S. military and government, it is not exclusive to the United States or any particular political ideology. Conclusion. The pentagram and pentagon are two shapes with deep roots in different cultures, religions, and organizations. Despite their differences in shape, both symbols have significant culture significance and association with the number 5. However, both symbols have been subject to misconceptions. It is essential to understand the true meaning and historical significance of these shapes to appreciate their beauty and recognize their role in the world. By gaining a better understanding, you stupid working class people, by gaining a better understanding of both symbols, similarities, and differences, we can avoid perpetuating misperception and appreciate their significance in various contexts. Okay, so let's get to the good part, the reason we're all gathered around here. The Pentagon has failed its annual audit for the sixth year in a row, according to the Defense Department's chief financial officer. Out of 29 individual sub-audits of the department, only 7 passed this year, the same as a year prior, Controller Mike McCord told reporters on Wednesday. One other received a qualified rating, a step down from passing, while 3 are ongoing and 18 were given failed. So they had all these different budget categories, okay? And it looked like 18 were given failing grades. But he said there was no fraud found. Well, they don't know what's going on. So how can you make statements about no fraud if you don't know what you're talking about, right? So this person, McCord, said that while things are showing progress, overall it's not enough. And here again, they bring in a black guy for this stuff, right? Just like they brought in Obama. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin feels we need to be doing better at this and moving faster. But a successful audit is still years away, he added. Federal law since the early 1990s requires mandatory audits for all government agencies. The Pentagon did not begin auditing itself until 2018 and has only had incremental improvements yearly. This time around, 1,600 auditors combed through Department of Defense's $3.8 trillion in assets and $4 trillion in liabilities, conducting some 700 site visits. They found that half of DOD's assets can't be accounted for. The auditing process is difficult. The auditing process is difficult for the Pentagon due to the sheer size and scope of the department. The Department of Defense makes up for more than half of the U.S. discretionary spending, and its assets range vastly, covering personnel, supplies, bases, and weapons. McCord last year admitted that each audit is getting a little harder due to much of the lower hanging fruit having been picked, meaning simpler issues have already been fixed. Lawmakers have also taken note of the trend of failed audits, and earlier this year, a bipartisan group of senators introduced legislation to ensure that DOD passes a clean audit next year. The bill follows repeated concerns from Congress about fraud, waste, and abuse in the Pentagon. Asked Thursday, this is like this last week, okay, whether the failed audit sends a bad message to U.S. adversaries and allies alike, Pentagon Deputy Press Secretary Sabrina Singh said the effort is a continuing and ongoing process. So she was asked if the failed audit sends a bad message to U.S. adversaries and allies alike. Yeah, it'd be like of me saying that all of a sudden, after sharing my work for all these years, admitting that I'm just a falling down drunk every night and I can't keep track of anything, right? When you admit things that you've lost complete control of your budget, how on earth is everybody supposed to protect you, right? This was one other article I found. The Pentagon's bottomless money pit. When the Defense Department flunked its first ever fiscal review, one of our government's greatest mysteries was exposed. Where does the DOD's $700 billion annual budget go? And this is a story from the Rolling Stone from 2019. A retired Air Force auditor, we'll call him Andy, tells a story about a thing that happened at Ogden Air Force Base in Utah sometime in early 2001. Something went wrong with a base inventory order. Andy thinks it was a simple data entry error. Someone ordered 5 of something, he said, and it came out as an order for 999,000. He laughs. It was probably just something the machine defaulted to. Type in an order for a part the wrong way, and it comes out all frickin' 9s in every field. Nobody actually delivered a monster load of parts, but the faulty transaction, the paper trail for a phantom industry adjustments never made, started moving through the Air Force's maze of internal accounting systems anyways. A junior level logistics officer caught it before it went out of house. Andy remembers the incident because, as accounting world in which the dollar value of the error was discussed. The Air Force, which had an $85 billion budget last year, nearly created in one stroke an accounting error more than a third of the size of the U.S. GDP, which was just over $10 trillion in 2001. Nobody lost money. It was just paper error, one that was caught. Even the Air Force notices a $1 trillion error, Andy says with a laugh. Now it has been $1 billion. It might have gone through. Years later, Andy watched as another massive accounting issue made its way into the military bureaucracy. The Air Force changed one of its financial reporting systems, and after the change, the service showed a negative number for inventory, everything from engine cores to landing gear in transit. Freaked out because you can't have a negative number of things in transit, Air Force accountants went back and tried to reverse the mistake. In doing so, somehow ended up adding more than $4 billion in value to the Air Force's overall spare parts inventory in a single month. This suspicious number is still there. You can see a sudden spike in the Air Force's working capital fund stagnant spare parts numbers. It was $23.2 billion in 2015, $23.3 billion in 2016, $24.4 billion in 2017, and then suddenly $28.8 billion in September 2018. That doesn't mean the money was lost or stolen. It does, however, mean the Air Force probably has less inventory on hand than it thinks it does. Now retired, Andy sometimes visits his neighborhood library, which uses RFID smart labels or radio frequency identification, allowing it to know when all the books, where all the books are at all times. Meanwhile, the Air Force, which has $156 billion annual budget, still doesn't always use serial numbers. It has no idea how much of almost anything it has at any given time. Nuclear weapons are the exception, and it started electronically tagging those only after 2 extraordinary mistakes. In 2006 and 2007, in the first, the Air Force accidentally loaded 6 nuclear weapons in a B-52 and flew them across the country, unbeknownst to the crew. In the other, the services sent nuclear nose cones by mistake to Taiwan, which had asked for helicopter batteries. What kind of organization, Andy asked, doesn't keep track of $20 billion in inventory? Despite being the taxpayer's greatest investment, more than $700 billion a year, the Department of Defense has remained an organizational black box throughout its history. It's repelled generations of official inquiries, the latest being an audit 3 decades in the making, mainly by scrambling its accounting into such a mess that it may never be untangled. Ahead of misappropriation, fraud, theft, overruns, contracting corruption, and other abuses that are almost certainly still going on, the Pentagon's first problem is its books. It's the world's largest producer of wrong numbers, an ingenious bureaucratic defense system that hides all the other rat's nests underneath. Meet the Gordian knot of legend brought to in modern America. At the tail end of last year, and right now we're in 2023, the Department of Defense finally completed an audit at the cost of $400 million. Some 1,200 auditors charged into the jungle of military finance, but returned in defeat. They were unable to pass the Pentagon or flunk it. They could only offer no opinion, explaining the military's empire of hundreds of economic accounting slips were too illogical to penetrate. The audit is the last piece in one of the great ass-covering projects ever undertaken, also known as the effort to give the U.S. government a clean bill of financial health. 29 years ago, in 1990, Congress ordered all government agencies to begin producing audited financial statements. That's pretty amazing. 1990. I guess I would have thought this was going on all along, right? Others complied. Defense refused from the jump. It took a Herculean legislative effort lasting 20 years to move the Pentagon off its intransigent starting point. In 2011, it finally agreed to be ready by 2017, which turned into 2018 when the Department of Defense finally compiled with compiled with part of the law ordering timely performance reports. Last November the 15th, when the WIFT audit was announced, Deputy Secretary of Defense said it was nothing to worry about because we never expected to pass it. Asked by a reporter why taxpayers should keep giving the Pentagon roughly $700 billion a year if it can't get their house in order and count ships right or buildings right. That was an inside joke. The joke was the Pentagon isn't so hot at counting buildings. Just a few years ago, in fact, it admitted to losing track of 478 structures, in addition to 39 Black Hawk helicopters, whose fully loaded versions list for $21 million a pop. That didn't mean 478 buildings disappeared, but they did vanish from the government's ledgers at some point. The Pentagon's bureaucracy is designed to spend money quickly and deploy troops and material to the field quickly, but it has no reliable method of recording transactions. It designs stealth drones and silent running submarines, but still hasn't progressed to barcodes when it comes to tracking inventory. Some of the accounting programs are using the ancient computing language COBOL, COBOL, which was cutting edge in 1959. These systems, as one Senate staffer puts it, were not designed to be audited. If and when the defense review is ever completed, we're likely to find a pile of Enrons with the military's losses and liabilities hidden in Enron-like special purpose vehicles, assets systematically overvalued, monies Congress approved for ex-felonious diverted to Program Y, contractors paid twice, parts bought twice, repairs done unnecessarily and at a great expense, and on and on. Enron, at its core, was an accounting maze that systematically hid losses and overstated gains in order to keep investor money flowing in. The Pentagon is an exponentially larger financial bureaucracy whose mark is the taxpayer. Of course, less overtly a criminal scheme, the military still churns out Enron-sized losses regularly. And this is only possible because its accounting is a long-tolerated fraud. We've seen, hold on one second here. I got a cat trying to crawl up in my lap here. Let me get her settled a minute here. Well, I don't know what she's doing, so I keep going here. I just want to make sure she doesn't step on my keys. Why don't you lay down, sweetie? Okay. The infamous F-35 Joint Strike Fighter program is now projected to cost the taxpayers $1.5 trillion, roughly what we spent on the entire Iraq War. Overruns and fraud from that program alone are currently expected to cost taxpayers about 100 times what was spent on Obama's solar energy deals. Meanwhile, the Defense Department a few years ago found about $125 billion in administrative waste, a wart that by itself was just twice the size of the $74 billion Enron bankruptcy. Inspectors found at least $6 billion to $8 billion in waste in the Iraq campaign and said $15 billion of waste found in the Afghan theater was probably only a portion of the total loss. Even the military's top line budget number is an Enron-esque accounting trick. Congress in 2011 passed the Budget Control Act, which caps the defense budget at approximately 54% of discretionary spending. Almost immediately, it began using so-called overseas contingency operations, a giant second checking account that can be raised without limit. Therefore, for this year, the Pentagon has secured $617 billion in base budget money, which puts it in technical compliance with the budget control law. But it also receives $69 billion in OCO money, sometimes described as war funding, a euphemism term for an open slush fund. Homeland Security, $56 billion. This one about, okay, let me see here. And then they also spent $19 billion for anti-ISIS. Okay, that's just what we know, because the drones are part of what they call a secret black budget. In a supreme irony, the auditor's search for boondoggles had itself become a boondoggle. In the early 90s and 2000s, the Department of Defense spent billions hiring private firms in preparations for last year. In many cases, those new outside accountants simply repeated recommendations that had already been raised and ignored by past government auditors like the Defense Inspector General. After last year's debacle, the services are now spending even more on outside advice to prepare for the next expected flop. The Air Force alone just awarded Duluth is one of the big accounting firms, up to $800 million to help the service with future audit preparation. The Navy countered with a $980 million audit. So, taxpayers, in other words, are paying gargantuan sums to private accounting firms to write reports about how previous recommendations were ignored. How long do you think you'd have your job if you behaved this way? Just asking. If you just buzzed off everybody in your entire organization, didn't do anything anybody told you to do, refused to do your budget for several years, how long would you have your job? It's all a catch-22 about a country trapped in an endless cycle of avoidable financial disaster. Each time we try to fix leaks, we end up back where we started, staring at even bigger numerical representations of failure. For instance, part of what inspired original investigators into defense finances were infamous stories in the 1980s and early 90s about the military charging $640 for toilet seats, $436 for hammers. A chief crusader was a young Iowa Senator, Chuck Grassley, who was so determined to hear such tales from famed military whistleblower Franklin Chuck Spinney. So, in the early 80s, Grassley drove to the Pentagon in an orange Corvette to see him. The DOD refused to let Grassley see Spinney. Grassley going to testify, and so what? The following Monday, his photo was on the cover of Time magazine. The March 1983 cover asked, "Are billions being wasted?" It seemed like a breakthrough. Spinney's tales of waste became symbols that aroused the imagination of both the left and the right, who each saw in them their own version of governments running amok. But for 35 years, Chuck Grassley, now 85, is still sending letters to the Pentagon about overpriced parts, only this time with more zeros added. The Iowan last year asked why we were spending more than $10,000 a piece for 3D printed airborne toilet seat covers, or $56,000 on 25 reheatable drinking cups at a brisk $1,208 each. The DOD has since claimed to have fixed these problems. Asked if he was frustrated that it's the same stories decades later, Grassley says, "Absolutely." He pauses. "After a long time after I leave the Senate, it'll still likely be the same problem." 3 decades into the effort to pry open the Pentagon's books, it is not clear if we've been going somewhere or if we've just been spending billions to get nowhere in one of the most expensive jokes any nation has ever played on itself. When everything is always a mystery, says Grassley, nothing ever has to be solved. That's why they always talk to us like we're so stupid. Well, I would explain to you the situation in the Middle East, but it is very complicated. So let's just leave it alone for now. Go back over there and keep working. We need your tax dollars. So how did this all happen? Well, it happened with an accident, okay? The only reason the audit is happening, according to this watchdog group, in 1985, a brusque Italian Albanian named Joe DiGardio ran as a Republican for a House seat in New York's 20th district. DiGardio was the son of an immigrant grocer. Before he went on to Jesuit education at Fordham, his schooling came into the aisles of his father's store. "I was trained in stock," DiGardio says today. "You learn value if you end up chasing someone down the street of the Bronx if they steal a box." In his teen years, he went on to be a waiter at Westchester County country clubs. He'd watch chefs steal steaks out of the kitchen at the end of every year, knowing that these rich people, if there was a deficit, they would just kick it in at the end of the year. From waiting tables, he went on to spend 22 years as an accountant at Arthur Andersen, among other things, diving into the New York City's financial collapse in the 70s. He recalls the city was still listed buildings that had been burned down as current assets. I learned a lot about the difference between public and private accounting, he remembers. In the mid-'80s, he ran as a Republican for Congress in a Westchester district. It was considered a safe blue seat with Democrats outnumbering Republicans. He calls himself the accidental congressman because if my party knew I would win, they wouldn't have put me up. I was a sacrificial lamb. But in a preview of cross-party populist currents, he did win, in part by highlighting his working class ethnic background, trumpeting his accounting credentials, and sounding bipartisan themes about cleaning up corruption. He promised to illuminate the dark fiscal corners of the federal bureaucracy. In Washington, DiGardio was horrified by the federal government's smoke and mirrors budgeting. He told fellow Republicans the technique Congress used would get private sector officers sent to jail. Joey the waiter, who is 78 today, still has the same tough-talking New York personality he had as a candidate. It's easy to laugh imagining how his insistent Bronx demeanor was received by some of his more upper crust and genteel colleagues back then. It would explain why he was first ignored when he began writing legislators to force the government to undergo the kind of auditing that's mandatory in the private sector. But when the savings and loan crisis plunged America into a financial scare in the late 80s, fiscal responsibility became a political catchword. Instantly, Joey the waiter was in demand. Suddenly, everyone was like, "Where's that bill DiGardio wrote?" he recalls. He found diverse allies in a pair of Democratic senators. The legislation forced government agencies to name a CFO. Amazing, isn't it? So this legislation, before this, they did not do audits. They did not create modern federal financial management structure. 23 agencies, from defense to labor to state, were ordered to begin submitting department-wide annual auditing financial statements by 1994. Although there were regulations over the years requiring various forms of financial reporting, nothing like a full-scale federal audit has ever been attempted. Incredibly, from an accounting perspective, the U.S. government has remained essentially virgin territory for centuries. As far back as 1787, the Constitution mandated a regular statement and account of the receipts and expenditures of all public money shall be published from time to time. But no independent examiner has ever fully checked the government's books. By the late 80s and the early 90s, hundreds of billions of tax dollars were being spent annually, and no one really knew where. To DiGardio, the situation was outrageous. It's a constant principle in history from the Medicis to today, said DiGardio. If no one's watching the money, there will be bankruptcies. The CFO Act at least introduced the idea that someone was supposed to be watching. Boy, when you start to dig into how this stuff got started, it's kind of crazy, isn't it? I guess we just have assumed that these people in their fancy, expensive suits were doing the right thing. So the CFO Act, okay, let me finish this part. The CFO Act at least introduced the idea that someone was supposed to be watching. By 1997, cabinet-level departments like Labor, Agriculture, and Commerce were submitting financial reports. 1997. In the first year, only 6 were able to pass. Within a few years, however, most were in compliance. By 2013, Defense was the only federal agency that had not submitted a financial statement. One of the main reasons the military wasn't submitting numbers was it did not have them. The Pentagon every year employs an accounting shortcut that should make more sense to civilians at this time of year, because it's similar to what roughly 6% of Americans who cheat on taxes do annually. Taxpayers who think they're owed deductions but don't have the receipts to back up their expenses will sometimes take a rough guess, maybe based on what their prior year deductions were. They then file returns infected with guesses, plugged in to make it look like the deductions were counted up honestly. The Pentagon basically does the same thing, only on a gigantic scale. At the end of every year, it submits a budget execution request that includes complete month-by-month statements of that year's spending. The White House will then take these numbers and use them to project a defense budget for the following year. The president submits that budget to Congress, which in turn will actually appropriate the money. Almost without exception, the Pentagon ends up getting a raise. For 2019, Donald Trump submitted a budget that asked for $716 billion, or $82 billion more than the Department of Defense received the previous fiscal year. The system makes sense, except for one problem. The financial reports the Pentagon submits are faked. The Defense Department, for the most part, does not know how much it spends. It has a handle on some things, like military pay, but in other places it's clueless. None of its services, Navy, Air Force, Army, Marine Corps, use the same system to record transactions or monitor inventory. Each service has its own operations and management budget, its own payroll system, its own R&D budget, and so on. It's an empire of disconnected budgets, or fiefdoms. Instead of using a single integrated financial accounting system that would maintain a global picture of its finances at all times, the Pentagon built another bureaucracy to pile atop the others, called the Defense Finance and Accounting System, or DFAS, created by then Defense Secretary Dick Cheney in 1991. Gotta tell you where the problem first got started, when Dick Cheney got in there. DFAS is in charge of collecting financial reports from all the different fiefdoms at the end of each month. DFAS is like a tribune traveling on horseback at month's end, collecting a pile of scrolls from each castle. In 2013, Reuters published a brutal expose showing how DFAS accountants conducted a mad scramble at the end of each month to try to piece together records of transactions to justify spending. But in thousands of cases a month, no records existed. We didn't have the details, one accountant explained. Complicating matters is the fact that money is allocated to the military on different schedules. If Congress gives the Navy $53 billion for operations and maintenance, as it did this year, the service is expected to spend all that money that year. Such expenses, payroll is another, are called one-year money. Meanwhile, research and development might be a 2-year money, and contracting might be 5-year money. There have been multiple cases involving officials taking advantage of flaws in the Pentagon system over the years. A civilian secretary bilked the Air Force out of $1.4 million for more than a decade before anybody noticed. If the Pentagon doesn't spend all the money in exactly the amounts Congress says it can spend in the time ordained by Congress, if it doesn't spend all its one-year money in 1 year, all its 5-year money in 5 years, and so on, the military is supposed to give its unspent money back to Congress. But the military is never really on time and constantly commingles its various pots of money. Grassley in the late 90s found out the military was using a computer program called MACUS, Mechanized of Contract Administration Services, to help speed this commingling. When the Pentagon had bills to pay, instead of just drawing the money from the right account, MACUS would sometimes try to spend old money first from whatever funds were about to expire. It's illegal for any government agency to spend money appropriated for one purpose on a different program. But the military, either hilariously or horribly, depending on your perspective, created a program that algorithmically produced such violations of the law. They weren't minor violations. Grassley has fought for years against such automatic payments, saying bureaucrats use them to avoid violations of the anti-efficiency law, which is a felony. Last year's audit found the Anti-Deficiency Act was one of 5 laws the agency violated. MACUS still exists, but it's unclear how or if it's been updated. In any case, defense still lacks records showing that it's paying for the right programs from the right accounts. Out of terror that it might have to return money as a result, the DOD orders its accountants to make numbers fit. Those DFAS accountants in the Reuters expose were told by superiors that if they couldn't find invoices or contracts to prove the various services spent their 1-year money on and 2-year money on, they should execute unsubstantiated change actions. In other words, lie. The accountant systematically plugged in fake numbers to match the payment schedules handed down by the Treasury. These fixes were called journal voucher adjustments, or plugs. As a result, those year-end financial statements will look like they match congressional intentions. In truth, these statements, packed with thousands of plugs, are fictitious, a form of systematic accounting fraud Congress has been quietly tolerating for decades. The fake number system is such long accepted practice that it's acquired numerous dull-sounding names. You'll see the invented numbers called forced balance entries by the General Accounting Office, adjustments not adequately supported by the Defense Inspector General, and journal vouchers, or JVs, or workarounds by the Pentagon's own Comptroller General. On the Hill, everyone refers to plugs. There are innocent explanations for plugs, although even the best excuses are still incompetent. For example, if the Navy buys a helicopter from the Army, which is the item manager, it will show up as an expense on the books of both services. Although the money has only been spent once, both the Army and the Navy will report the expense. Instead of canceling out intramural accounting discrepancies, which is what would happen at any chain of donut shops, the Department of Defense never bothered to fix its accounting rules. With hundreds of different acronymic systems, a single error might generate bogus numbers exceeding the transaction's original value. This is a generous explanation for news of the sort released by the Inspector General in 2016, showing the Army, with an annual budget of $122 billion, generated accounting plugs 54 times that amount, a full $6.5 trillion. So they were only supposed to spend $122 billion, but somehow they spent $6.5 trillion. When civilians analysts see these numbers, they always first assume they're typos because no company could survive such gargantuan accounting snafus. When I saw that 6.5 trillion number for the first time, I thought it had to be a mistake, said this university professor, who in 2017 led a study that discovered 21 trillion in plugs over a 17-year period. I thought it was maybe 6 billion, but it's really 6 trillion. And there is this person you might want to look up called Mark Skidmore, Skidmore, and he had a group of students and they decided to take a look at the budget. Well, what happened after that? Well, as these stories leaked out to the public, the huge numbers became talking points on social media. Skidmore's $21 trillion figure doesn't mean that much money was wasted or is sitting in a Swiss account somewhere. The Pentagon didn't even receive that much money during the time period in question. Moreover, some of the plugs were adjustments upward and some downward. If they were ever netted out, no one has ever tried. The size of the accounting whole might be smaller. However, according to Andy and others, the $21 trillion figure may undercount the accounting errors in the system, as some plugs are both automated and unidentified. What's clear is that the ubiquitous plugging and quality of bad numbers in the Pentagon's books are so massive that it will take a labor of the ages to untangle. All of this is difficult to follow, but the key is that when a suspicious number pops up anywhere in the military's multiple accounting silos, it typically is not investigated, but simply fixed on paper and sent on its way. In a private company, if inventory numbers suddenly jump by a few $billion in 1 month, the auditors would swarm warehouses in search of the problem. The military can't say the same. This was one of the things auditors found last year, but the Pentagon lacked policies and procedures to confirm the existence of government property in possession of contractors. This is a fancy way of saying that the Pentagon doesn't send inspectors to make sure Lockheed Martin or Boeing or whoever still have parts they say they're repairing or maintaining. This ultimately is the conclusion of the audit. We don't have anything like a full picture of what waste and abuse might be hidden under those plugs, though we have an idea. We do, however, know the Pentagon's books are so chocked with bad data that discovering abuses in real time is virtually impossible. Compound that with decades of cuts to the Pentagon staff of criminal investigators, and you have an open invitation to crime. Invoices could be systematically inflated for decades and no one would know. As Andy, the Air Force accountant, puts it, the system is desensitized to fraud. If you ask congressional staffers why the plugging system is permitted, they just shrug. Congress really has only 2 ways to respond when the DOD breaks the law. Elected officials can shout and criticize the Pentagon or withhold funds. The former is not terribly effective, and the latter has so far proved politically impossible. No other federal agency could get away with this. The military has been told repeatedly to stop plugging and develop more rational accounting system. In case after case, reforms compound problems. One of the first fixes was aimed at the infamous toilet seats and hammers. The General Accounting Office in 1992 issued a report blasting the military for poor cost estimating and suggested changes. The result was the invention of a creature called the prime vendor, basically a middleman with the power to set prices and choose subcontractors. This system only inflates prices. By 2004, defense was spending $7.4 billion annually on prime vendor purchases after spending $2.3 billion in 22. So they hiked up from $2.3 billion to $7.4 billion. Night Rider newspapers got wind of this, and in 2005 reported the military is now buying 85-cent ice trays from prime vendors for $20 a piece. Within a month, a refrigerator for a C-5 airplane was being dragged on the floor of a House hearing, and a Navy admiral named Keith was being asked by California's Duncan Hunter to explain why he bought 9 fridges from a prime vendor for $32,000. Over the years, this pattern repeated itself. An attempt to standardize the military's payroll and personnel record systems, it took 12 years and cost more than $1 billion before being scrapped. In 2005, the Air Force set out to buy a standardized computer system from Oracle called the Expeditionary Combat Support System. It took 7 years and more than $1 billion for that plan to be scrapped. The same motif held with regard to the military's promises about audit readiness. The Pentagon initially said it would be ready to be audited by 1997. After that date passed with a yawn. Pentagon officials made a series of bold promises. In 2003, Defense Comptroller told the Budget Committee, "We anticipate having a clean audit by 2007. Soon after disavowing that promise, he said, "The further we dug, the more difficulties turned up." In 2005, Pentagon began supplementing its verbal promises with reports called Financial Improvement and Audit Readiness Plan. This report basically told you every year that we were getting closer to sorting all this stuff out. Some exceptions. December 2005, progress has been achieved. September 2006, progress has been made. September 2007, progress has been made in several areas. March 2008, substantial progress has been made. March 2009, significant progress has been made, but much more needs to be done. The Pentagon has been attempting to conduct department-wide audits dating back to 1996. By the mid-2000s, perhaps 100 auditors from the DOD Inspector General, plus 100 or more from the various services, were annually trying to create a single financial statement, despite an almost complete lack of audit trail information. They made some helpful recommendations, but would never get very far before concluding an audit was not possible. "We were trying to make chicken soup out of chicken shit," said an auditor with a sad laugh. After nearly 15 years of such exercises, Grassley grew so furious that he introduced an amendment ordering the Pentagon to stop trying to audit itself until it was capable of doing something useful. The amendment passed and lived on as Section 103. The 2010 amendment ordered the Pentagon to actually be ready by 2017. The Grassley Amendment stopped the annual mobilization of auditors, but didn't stop the audits completely. The two competing laws, the CFO Act and the 2010 NDAA, created a literal catch-22, and these services both ordered and not ordered by law to compete audits of themselves. Funny how that works, huh? These services tried to spend their way out of the problem. Incredibly, they began competing to see how much they could blow on audit readiness programs. In 1997, the Army splurged at least $4 billion on the Global Combat Support System, which the Center for Public Integrity said was designed to centralize a dozen different outmodeled accounting systems. The smaller Marine Corps developed its own system with the same name, and they dropped $1 billion. I think these budget things are starting to sound more like the tricks they use for war, right? So I'm going to close off with this article because, after all, I can only read so much horror in one day. Let me see here. Well, bottom line is this, okay? Bottom line is this: out of control. They don't have to answer to anybody. And let me go over here and pull open just one file here before I'll be done. Okay. I would encourage you to read the article I have posted about lemon water for detoxing, and use real lemons. Do not use that bottled stuff. That bottled lemon stuff is full of chemicals. Okay, so let me pull up one file here just to tell you a little bit more about these people. I'll just do one of them. This article is from 2019. Defense Department computer network among top sharers of child pornography. And I hear all these people on social media, they're talking about, well, we're the gay people and we support the Muslims. Well, I don't think you understand how all this works, right? I don't think in general Muslims are really into all of this, I don't know, child pornography, all this kind of stuff that people here in this country seem to live for, which we'll get back to with that Babylon stuff. But yeah, all this sexual activity, all of the pornography all over the place. Does it surprise us that the Department of Defense an investigation by the National Criminal Justice Training Program concluded that the U.S. Department of Defense, or DOD, is one of the top networks for peer-to-peer sharing of pornographic images of children, and it ranked number 19 out of the 2,819 networks that were examined. So the Department of Defense ranks number 19. The problem is so pervasive among DOD employees and contractors that legislation has been written for increased investigation into these crimes. The illegal activity leaves the government perpetuators open to blackmail. And I followed up on this. I'll finish here. Department of Defense computers are among the top distributors of child pornography. An untold number of Department of Defense employees and contractors have subscriptions to child pornography websites. And the problem is apparently so pervasive, it requires new technical solutions to address it. Hundreds of DOD-affiliated individuals were recently identified as suspects in child pornography cases, according to an investigation by the Defense Criminal Investigation Services. So far, authorities have only looked into about 20% of these cases, but already they found several individuals using their government devices to download or share said pornographic material. Last year, an investigation by the National Criminal Justice Training Program found DOD computers were among the top networks nationwide for peer-to-peer sharing of pornographic images of minors. Yeah, pretty good when your Department of Defense ranks number 19 in the child pornography thing now, doesn't it? And when I talked about this in the past, they had some hearings in Congress about all of the child pornography on these computers. And what happened to that thing? Well, nothing. What they do is they have all these big hearings. We're going to get to the bottom of this child pornography. Can't happen in this country, the United States. We're a Christian organization. Yeah, we'll see how Christian you are in the end here, right? You child raping psychopaths. But anyway, so I'm going to be closing this off for now. Sad to say, I'll be going away. Yeah. And I have lots of articles down there for you to take a look at. Information is your friend. Ignorance is our enemy. Be safe out there and goodbye for now. But I did have one more thing to say. If anybody is trusting the Department of Defense, you really lined yourself up with a good show, Pony, now, didn't you? All those medals, all those awards, everybody looks so official and so smart, so sophisticated, all their big college educations. Full disclosure, I was raised on a U.S. military basis when I was a young child. Not a good way to grow up. But those U.S. military bases, it's kind of funny how they're stealing all this money by their books and stuff, but yet U.S. military people now actually have to rely on food stamps. Do you realize that a pretty good percentage, not going to look it up today, but you can look it up yourself, a pretty good percentage of people serving active duty in the U.S. military right now have to get food stamps and benefits in order to survive. They don't even treat their own people right. So if you're one of their people, they are using you. They're using you big time because they want to get this over the finish line. They need people like you to get rid of people like me. Are you really doing the right thing? Remember, this is the last chapter of the game board. I am so sure of that, I can't even see straight, okay? So we're playing the last chapter of the game board. Is it really a good idea to be wasting your time and not getting prepared? I don't know. That's certainly a question for you to decide, right? So anyways, be safe out there and goodbye.